This is a story from when my aunt worked as a part-time cleaner at a large shopping mall. Although it had been open for about a year, the building and facilities were still new and clean, and it was thriving despite being in a rural area. However, an unsettling rumor began to circulate among the employees. It was said that a female ghost appeared in the second-floor restroom. While such stories are common, the building was new, and the land had previously been just fields with no particular history. When my aunt first heard the rumor, she thought of it as nothing more than a school ghost story or urban legend. But coinciding with the spread of this rumor, injuries and illnesses among employees began to increase. Of course, with hundreds of people working there, some coincidences were bound to happen. However, strangely enough, the majority of employees who fell ill or got injured were those who worked on the second floor. For security reasons, this shopping mall had customers and employees use the same restrooms. In other words, it seemed that people who regularly used the restroom in question were the ones being affected. The same was true for the cleaning staff. Those assigned to the second floor restroom kept falling ill and quitting one after another. Eventually, even among the cleaning staff, voices of dislike for that particular restroom became prevalent. As a result, some part-timers and full-time employees had to take turns cleaning it. Sometime later, a middle-aged woman, let's call her Mrs. Tanaka, joined as a new part-time cleaner. After she had learned the basics of the job and started to get along with the other part-timers, the rumor about the restroom came up in conversation. While everyone was chattering, saying things like, "It's creepy, isn't it?" And "I feel sorry for those on duty, but I really don't want to do it," Mrs. Tanaka suddenly said. "Then I'll take it home with me today." The room fell silent for a moment, followed by a burst of laughter from everyone. There was something oddly satisfying about talking about the ghost, as if it were some kind of unwanted luggage. One of the part-timers asked, "Oh my, how are you going to take it home?" Mrs. Tanaka replied that she would carry it on the rack of her bicycle. Everyone thought she really had a great sense of humor and returned to their posts. My aunt wasn't present at that time, but heard about it as a funny story from her coworkers when they returned from their break. At the end of that workday, my aunt happened to meet Mrs. Tanaka at the bicycle parking area as she was about to go home. Most of the part-timers lived nearby and commuted by bicycle. "I heard about it," my aunt said. "You're taking that ghost home with you." Mrs. Tanaka, with a serious face, said, "That's right," and pointed at the rack of her bicycle. My aunt, who had thought it was a joke, felt a bit confused by Mrs. Tanaka's serious expression. She managed a strained smile and said, I see. Take care," as she waved her hand. Mrs. Tanaka's face broke into a smile, and she said cheerfully, "See you tomorrow," as she pedaled away. The next day, during the pre-shift meeting, my aunt and her coworkers were informed that Mrs. Tanaka had been hit by a large truck on her way home and had passed away. All the part-time workers, including my aunt, quit their jobs at once. This happened a few years ago. I was a member of a research team at a certain company. It wasn't the kind of research job where you wear a lab coat and handle chemicals. What we were working on was camera face recognition systems and their applications. We'd install an application on a main computer, feed it footage from security cameras in various locations, and it would automatically create logs of recognized faces and their movements. However, since that kind of thing was already quite common at the time, we started adding more functions to the base face recognition application. The first thing we tackled was implementing age estimation. The mechanism was similar to weather forecasting. We'd preload thousands of faces with their corresponding ages as a correct answer list, and when the camera recognized a face, it would output an estimated age based on this list. Despite being a simple method, it was quite accurate. Even in the testing phase, about 40% of estimates were spot on, with the rest having an error margin of plus or minus 8 years. It was pretty interesting. But age estimation was something everyone was working on, so we struggled to implement something more unique. Fortunately, we had a large sample of face photos and personal information to experiment with. The sample data included names, educational background, birthplace, and so on. Name prediction was obviously impossible. Computers can't understand such discrete data. But surprisingly, education level estimation, which was limited to 4 categories, middle school, high school, university, and top university graduates, boasted nearly 60% accuracy. Also, when we had the computer recognize birthplaces as continuous values from Hokkaido to Okinawa, it achieved almost 10% accuracy at the prefectural level. Don't scoff at 10%. This was quite shocking. While humans can roughly estimate age, not many people can correctly guess someone's birthplace even once out of 10 tries. In short, with a sufficient sample size, computer predictions can be quite reliable. This is where the main story begins. One day, one of our team's rather mad scientists, let's call him Takagi, suggested, let's try estimating life expectancy. Of course, there's no life expectancy column in personal information samples. Takagi said, we can use photos of historical figures whose years of birth, death, and photo taking are known. The recognition accuracy wasn't greatly affected even with black and white photos, right? Indeed, while the accuracy might drop slightly compared to color samples, it's not a significant issue for the face recognition mechanism. But wouldn't we lack sufficient samples? All we need is the face, the date the photo was taken, and the date of death. There are plenty of photos of disaster and accident victims. We can use those. When a team member objected that this would include samples of people who died from external factors, Takagi just grinned and said, "That's fine." It seemed Takagi wasn't aiming to estimate a person's health condition from their appearance, but rather to make the computer perform something akin to a street fortune teller's predictions. While we had some reservations about using deceased people as samples, we were all pretty curious back then, so we immediately got to work. We spent weeks inputting data, calculating life expectancy by subtracting the year the photo was taken from the year of death, along with the photos. We reached 2,000 samples. Then we ran a test. Of course, since we don't know the correct answer, there's no way to calculate the error margin, but we decided to give it a try anyway. I was the first test subject. I stood in front of the camera after activating the system. The face was immediately focused, and after a few seconds of calculation, the result was a life expectancy of 60 years. At the time, we were all in our early 20s, except for our leader who was in his 30s. Considering the average male life expectancy is in the 80s, we thought this might be pretty accurate. So we had other members try it too, but maybe because the sample size was still small, the answers were all over the place. 23, 112, 75, 42. Quite inconsistent results. Takagi, of all people, was given a life expectancy of 0 years. Maybe it was impossible to have a computer mimic a fortune teller after all, but having manually input 2,000 samples, we couldn't just shelve the project. So we left it running in automatic log generation mode overnight, pseudo-reading camera footage from various locations stored on the company's server. The next day, the computer had properly generated thousands of recognition logs. When we applied statistical analysis, an interesting fact emerged. There was a significant variation in the estimated values depending on the location where the footage was captured. For example, the average life expectancy prediction for cameras in elementary schools was 106 years. This is far higher than the overall average of 46 years. Conversely, the first location to fall below the overall average was footage captured at rest areas, with an average of 38 years. Is it trying to say that people who drive die earlier? The average values kept decreasing, with a nursing home in the prefecture coming in second to last with an average of 15 years. The lowest, as you might guess, was the hospital. The average there was a mere 4 years. At this point, we became skeptical. Even for a hospital, isn't an average life expectancy of 4 years strange? Not everyone in a hospital is on the verge of death. For example, there should be many young people with long lives ahead of them, like students brought in for sports injuries. Thinking there must be an error, I checked the raw logs. What I saw made me gasp. The logs listed life expectancy values after each individual ID. Among the normal numbers, like 34 or 50, there were several entries with numbers that shouldn't exist. Numbers that shouldn't exist. Negative numbers. Just to be sure, I quickly checked logs from other locations. While I found 2 or 3 entries with minus signs everywhere, nowhere had as many as the hospital logs. These negative numbers in the logs, if interpreted literally, would mean something like minus 3 years of life expectancy equals 3 years after death. The reason the hospital's average life expectancy was so low was due to the extreme number of these negative life expectancy individuals. Our team came to 2 possible conclusions. 1, life expectancy predictions have too large an error margin to be reliable. Or 2, there are people with negative life expectancies walking around us normally. I tried to stay calm, but cold sweat ran down my back. For the project's conclusion, we naturally went with the former. The error margin is too large to be reliable. We told the higher-ups we were researching health conditions using face recognition and wrote up a suitable report. This project was then buried in darkness. Every day, we pass by and make eye contact with hundreds of people. How can we be sure none of them have a face with negative life expectancy? Takagi, who had been given a 0 years life expectancy, actually died within a year. Apparently, he took a big jump from the platform towards a passing express train. How could the computer predict that? I have no idea. The only information the computer had was the sample and the subject's face. But the fact remains, Takagi died just as predicted. Since this incident, I get uneasy in crowds. To be honest, I'm scared. The same goes for security cameras. I can't help but imagine what they might be capturing, and it fills me with anxiety. Unless it's a matter of life and death or absolute necessity, I avoid going anywhere near hospitals. This is a story I heard. Mr. Kawasaki lived in a solitary house by a forest road. He grew vegetables in his field and worked at construction sites while also continuing the family tradition of small-scale forestry tasks on their woodland. He kept working in the forest until he was about 70 years old. One day, after finishing his work in the forest and taking a break, he casually glanced towards the logging road on the slope below. He noticed a figure standing next to his mini-truck parked by the roadside. The distance was too great to make out details, but it seemed like the figure was peering into the car through the side window. Concerned about potential mischief, Mr. Kawasaki let out a loud, commanding shout towards the car, his voice echoing through the forest. The figure turned its head and seemed to stare back at him. Undeterred, Mr. Kawasaki called out again, this time questioning the figure's interest in his truck. His voice carried a mix of suspicion and challenge. The figure then slowly moved off the logging road, descending the opposite slope and disappearing into the trees. When Mr. Kawasaki finished packing up and came down the mountain, he walked around the mini-truck before getting in, but found nothing particularly unusual. There were a few greasy handprints on the windows, but the doors were still locked, with no signs of tampering. He tossed his belongings into the cargo bed, unlocked the door, and got in. He started the engine and began driving down the logging road. As the truck bounced along the unpaved road, something rolled out from under the passenger seat. He stopped the car and picked it up. It was a whittled figure, about 12 inches tall. It was rough and barely detailed except for 2 small X marks carved where the eyes should have been. Of course, there had been nothing like this in the car that morning. However, the doors had been locked when he came down the mountain, and it seemed unlikely that the figure he saw could have put it in the car. Feeling uneasy, Mr. Kawasaki threw the figure into a valley on his way home. From that day on, strange things began happening whenever he rode in his mini-truck. The ashtray would be stuffed full of dead leaves and soil. Greasy handprints would appear on the inside of the passenger side window. The passenger seat would be damp on rainy days, and newspapers left in the car would be torn to shreds and scattered about. These incidents continued despite Mr. Kawasaki always locking the car when leaving it. Then one day, while working in the forest, Mr. Kawasaki tripped on some bamboo roots. As he fell, he struck both eyes on a diagonally cut bamboo, blinding himself. Now, unable to see, Mr. Kawasaki left his house by the forest road and moved to live with his son and daughter-in-law in the town at the foot of the mountain. Today, the house by the forest road stands abandoned with no tenants, and the mini-truck remains parked in its garage. There haven't been any particularly dramatic supernatural occurrences. However, there was one incident. A local elementary school student, while passing by the abandoned house at dusk with his father, suddenly said, "There's someone in the mini-truck." The puzzled father looked at the truck but saw no one inside. He thought his child must have been mistaken, but the child insisted there really was someone there. When asked what the person looked like, the child thought for a moment, then replied, "I'm not sure, but they were staring at me with completely white eyes." This is a story about my friend. Let's call him Kenji. Late one night, Kenji remembered that he had lent money to a friend. Kenji urgently needed a large sum of cash, and if his friend could repay the loan, it would solve his financial problem. Making a phone call to ask for money in the middle of the night was inconsiderate, but Kenji was desperate. Kenji usually communicated with this friend through messaging apps or Skype, as they rarely had the chance to talk about important matters. However, this time, Kenji worried that his friend might not notice a notification from a messaging app or Skype. Since he urgently needed the money back, Kenji decided to make a phone call. Kenji dialed the number he had jotted down for emergencies when messaging apps or Skype weren't available. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. Kenji immediately launched into his demand for the money. His friend replied that he had just withdrawn some cash while out shopping and could repay the loan right away. Relieved, Kenji started chatting with his friend about trivial matters, just like they usually did. The conversation drifted to a commercial they had seen for a convenience store. Kenji casually mentioned how good the food looked. "Hey, why don't you come over?" his friend suggested. "There's a convenience store near my place that rarely runs out of stock. We could grab something there on the way to my house." Thinking this was a great idea, Kenji got ready and started pedaling his bike, phone in hand. When he mentioned that he'd forgotten the exact location of his friend's house, his friend offered to guide him. "Go straight until you hit the parking lot at the end, then turn right onto the main street. See the Chinese takeout place? There's a narrow alley next to it. Take that. It's a shortcut." The directions were so precise and easy to follow that Kenji started to remember the way. After cycling for a while, he recalled the route completely and told his friend that he didn't need any more directions before hanging up. When Kenji arrived at his friend's place, the apartment was dark. Thinking his friend might have fallen asleep in that short time, he repeatedly rang the doorbell. His friend answered, looking annoyed as if he hadn't been expecting anyone. "What the hell, man? Do you know what time it is? Are you crazy?" Kenji shot back, "You just told me to come over to repay the money." His friend replied, "Huh? Money? Oh yeah, I haven't paid you back, but I never said anything about that. I didn't even call you." Confused, Kenji pulled out his phone to show the call history. There was indeed his friend's number. Just as he thought he had proven his point, his friend dropped a bombshell. "Look, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't get my own number wrong, but isn't this number different from mine?" Growing increasingly scared, Kenji asked his friend to double-check the number on his own phone. It turned out that Kenji had indeed written down the wrong number. The entire phone call had been with a complete stranger. After hearing the whole story, his friend tried to calm Kenji down, saying, "Well, I guess the person you accidentally called just happened to owe someone money too. What a crazy coincidence. About the money I owe you, I'm sorry. I'll pay you back by the end of the week. But Kenji couldn't shake off his fear. He explained to his friend why he was so terrified. But I was guided here to your house by that wrong number. That statement sent chills down his friend's spine too. If this was true, not only did some stranger know where Kenji lived, but they also knew his friend's address. Because of this incident, both of them ended up moving. And now, Kenji is afraid of phone calls. The reason is obvious. He's terrified that if he answers a call, he might hear that same deep voice that sounded so much like his friend's. It happened during a summer visit to my family home in Shikoku. My older sister and her husband had brought their 1-year-old baby. The night was hot and humid, and the baby wouldn't fall asleep. So, my grandparents' parents' sister and her husband, with their baby and I, 8 of us in total, were staying up late in the living room. My family's old house is near the sea. Through the window facing the garden, we could see the guest house illuminated by the light from the main house, floating in the darkness. Besides that, only my sister's car was visible. Being close to the sea, we could hear the sound of waves through the window screens. Despite the humid heat, we were enveloped in the comfort of countryside living. As we were all drinking tea and chatting, my sister took out her iPad and said, "Let me show you something interesting," and pressed a button. She wanted to show our grandparents and parents the voice recognition feature that transcribes spoken words into text, like dictation, on the notepad screen. My sister held the iPad close to the baby's mouth and coaxed, "Say something." The baby responded with some babbling sounds like goo-goo, ooh, wah, gaga. The screen then displayed "Who knew a war gaga?" as if forcibly transcribing the baby's voice into words. My sister laughed and said, "Look, it's translating baby talk." Our grandparents and parents smiled, saying, "How interesting. That's amazing." After a while, my sister sat the baby on her lap again and said, "Okay, now say Grandpa," as she held the iPad towards the baby. The baby made the longest string of sounds that day, wah-wah, kia-kia, aya, kia-kia, while enthusiastically tapping on the iPad screen. Suddenly, the screen displayed, "Mr. Omiya is here." My sister laughed, saying, "Wow, it made a proper sentence. I wonder who Mr. Omiya is." However, our grandparents gasped in surprise and leaned closer to the screen. "Is this Mr. Omiya registered in the device? Is his name stored in it?" Our grandfather stared at the screen, puzzled. Our grandmother also looked at the screen and said, "Mr. Omiya was a friend of Grandpa's. It's saying Mr. Omiya is here." She tilted her head, confused. Seeing this, my sister looked up at them, saying, "Huh?" At that moment, my mother pointed towards the window. "Over there, by the guest house." We all looked out the window and saw what appeared to be a figure wearing a sun hat, standing with a slightly bowed head in front of the guest house across the garden. Our grandfather immediately whispered, "It's Mr. Omiya." Our grandmother added, "Yes, it's Mr. Omiya, but he passed away in February. How—" As we were stretching our necks, trying to get a better look out the window and mumbling, "Huh? What?" Our grandmother stood up, saying, No, we shouldn't do this," and swiftly closed the curtains. That was all that happened, but when Grandma closed the curtains and everyone fell silent for a moment, I felt a fear I had never experienced before, and I nearly screamed. Immediately after, we decided to go around and close all the windows. My sister's husband and I were assigned to this task. We couldn't split up to do it, so we went together to close each open window. We weren't sure if closing the windows would actually keep spirits out, but we couldn't help doing it. My sister and her husband were completely frightened. They had been staying in the guest house during their visit, but that night they prepared futons in the main house. I couldn't stop thinking about what might be beyond the closed curtains, and I foolishly asked my sister, "Why don't you ask the baby if Mr. Omiya is still out there?" Grandma immediately stopped this. "We really shouldn't do that. It might not even be Mr. Omiya.